very pleased to welcome Dr. Daniel Greene from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He's one of the curators of the exhibit, so we're very excited to hear what he has to say today. After he has his presentation, we'll take a little break and resume upstairs about 6:15 to do a guided tour of the exhibit. In the meantime, you can go to the restroom, which is next to the elevator on each floor, and we'll have refreshments in this little kitchen through there, so you can just grab what you want. And
thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm really happy to be here. This is one of 100 stops for the exhibition around the country at public libraries and university libraries. Is the sound good? Yeah, okay, you can all hear me. And I especially want to thank Lisa Christian and just the entire staff here for everything they've done to get to this point. And as you'll see, there's a slate of great programs over the next 6 weeks. So I hope you'll have a chance to see the exhibition with me tonight, but then come back off and tell your friends and have them come see the exhibition as well. So tonight I'm going to talk about a difficult history, about what Americans knew about the threat of Nazism while the Nazis were in power between 1933 and 1945. Our approach at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is not to tell people what to think, it's to tell them what to think about, right? So you can have your own ways of struggling through this history. It's a history to struggle with. But you can see what we try to do is ask difficult questions about this history. And two of the most important questions we ask are, what did Americans know? And what more could have been done? So what did Americans know about Nazism? What did they know about the persecution and murder of Europe's Jews as it was happening? And one of the takeaways tonight is that the answer is a lot. Americans knew a lot about what was happening. Or if I were to say it more carefully, I would say Americans had access to a lot of information about what was happening to Jews in Europe. Did they always pay attention? That's harder to say. Did they always understand what they were reading in the newspapers or hearing on the radio? That's also harder to say. Think about international news stories today, right, where we see atrocities abroad. Do we read those stories every single day? Maybe, maybe not. Do we start a story and not finish it? Maybe, maybe not. Do we understand everything that we're reading as we're reading it and all the intricacies? Maybe and maybe not, right? But that's, and Americans in the 1930s were no different. So we'll focus tonight on what Americans knew, and then the second question is harder. What more could have been done? What more might the United States have done to help Europe's Jews that were targeted for persecution and murder during that time? One thing that's really important to understand, I think, about how Americans respond to atrocities abroad and how Americans respond to international events abroad is we also have to consider what's going on at home. The way and this is true throughout history, throughout the 250 years of American history. When we're looking at atrocities abroad, the conditions at home matter. So I want to focus with you first on what did America look like when the Nazis rose to power in 1933, and even before the Nazis rose to power in 1933. I'm going to stick over here because I'm going to show you a lot of slides tonight. Here's a World War I veteran on the street in the early 1930s. You can see that he can't see. He's wearing a sign that says, "I gave my eyes," and he's selling newspapers out on the street. This is in Philadelphia, but you could have seen this in multiple American locations. World War I ended in 1919. So when the Nazis come to power in 1933, World War I is 14, 15 years in the rearview mirror. You have a lot of young veterans and other Americans who don't want to go to war. Most Americans in the 1930s thought entering World War I had been a mistake, and they want to stay out of future wars if they happen. We have a segregated America at this time. It's Jim Crow America. This is North Carolina, a segregated drinking fountain. Schools are segregated. Public facilities are segregated. Churches are segregated. And sometimes that segregation is enforced through law, and sometimes it's enforced through violence. Why does this matter for this history? If you know some of the early Nazi history, some of the laws that the Nazis are passing in Germany in 1933 and 1934, 35, in their first few years. They're laws that say things like Jews can't be in public parks with non-Jews. Jews can't swim in public pools with non-Jews. Jewish lawyers can't have non-Jewish clients. Jewish doctors can't treat non-Jewish patients. To a lot of Americans, that looks like Jim Crow America, right? Nazi Germany is going to take a very different path, right? That's going to evolve into mass murder. But there are even moments where when the United States criticizes the Nazis for their treatment of Jews, sometimes Nazi propaganda points back at the United States and says, you live in a segregated society too, right? So this segregation matters at that time. This is my hometown of Chicago, a soup kitchen, when the bottom falls out of the American economy in 1929, right? October 1929, you get a crash of the stock market. By 1933, when President Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, unemployment is 25%. So, and it's a slow recovery, and it's not a linear recovery. There's times in the 1930s that the economy gets better and then it crashes again. We're going to be in a depression for 10 years throughout the 1930s. That's the worst economy that anyone alive had ever known in their lives. So why does that matter? It matters because as things get worse for the Jews in Germany and throughout Europe, a lot of them are going to seek to come to the United States. When we have a bad economy, usually Americans don't want immigrants coming in, right? There usually is a rhetoric of we can't let immigrants in, those immigrants are going to take our jobs, right? We see that throughout American history. We call ourselves a nation of immigrants. This is New York Harbor. You can see the Statue of Liberty in the background, and we are a nation of immigrants, right? The United States has been a nation that's let in many millions of immigrants over time that have lived out the American dream, right? Have had better lives here than they could have had in other lands. But as we'll see in this history, we're also a nation that at times has closed its doors to immigrants. So both things are true about the United States. We've been a land that's been open to immigrants and has defined ourselves by a history of immigration. And at times, as we'll see today, we'll learn about today, and as you learn about in the exhibition, we'll also be a nation that closes its doors to immigrants. And we see a rise of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. This is Washington, D.C., outside the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1920s. The Klan wants to draw boundaries around who's allowed in America and who's not, right? So the Klan is deeply racist against African Americans, a deeply anti-Catholic organization, and an anti-Jewish organization. And sometimes they will enforce their vision for America through violent means as well. Right, so those are some of the preconditions of what the United States looks like even before we see the rise of Nazism. Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, but already we're an isolationist nation, right, that doesn't want to get involved in international affairs. We think it was a mistake to have been involved in international affairs. Our doors are pretty much closed to immigrants. The United States Congress passed a severely restrictive immigration law in 1924. I'll talk more about that a little bit later and show you how that influenced immigration. But that law was designed to keep out Southern and Eastern Europeans, and that's where the Jews lived in Europe. And we're a nation that's going through its own economic struggles. And then in 1933, we look abroad and we see this, right? Here's Adolf Hitler, a new German chancellor. Germany's democracy, Germany's Weimar democracy had been quite weak and unstable, and democracy collapses quickly. Hitler becomes chancellor in January of 1933. By July of 1933, so 6-7 months later, all other political parties are illegal in Germany. It's illegal to not be a part of the Nazi party. So Hitler, as the leader of Germany, becomes, Hitler is the biggest symbol of the party, and the party itself becomes the state. Right? Germany changes its flag in 1935 to be the swastika flag, right? That had been the party flag, not Germany's flag. right? So there's no difference. What fascism does is it blurs all the lines between the party and the state, and there's no difference between the party and the state. So Americans are fascinated with Hitler, and you see Hitler on the cover of American magazines constantly. This is Vanity Fair from November of 1932 with Hitler on the cover. Time magazine from 1933. I could have shown you dozens and dozens of magazines. And this shouldn't surprise us, right? It's not secret news that there's a new leader in Germany and that Germany's democracy has collapsed in 6 months. We also see stories like this in the American press. So this is Joseph Goebbels. He's the Nazi minister of propaganda. He's one of Hitler's right-hand people. And this is July of 1933, so we're 6 or 7 months into the Nazi reign. And I know you can't see what it says here. It says Minister of Propaganda Goebbels, and then it says, say it in your dreams, the Jews are to blame. So what you have here is long-form journalism. It's like a 3,000-word article that explains to American readers that the Nazis explain the world by blaming Jews for all the problems of the world, right? The Nazis feel that Germany feels they got a very raw deal coming out of World War I, that they had to pay reparations to the rest of the world that were unfair, and that they're continually being punished. And why do the Nazis think they lost the war? They think they lost the war because Jews stabbed them in the back. So American readers in 1933 can read that the Nazis explained the world by blaming Jews. Now, we know how this story is going to end, right? We know that this is going to lead to Holocaust and mass murder. The Nazis did not know this in 1933. So I'm not up here saying, look at this, and Americans should have known. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to wag my finger at people in the past and say they should have known better. But what this does show us is that there was a lot of information in the American press about anti-Semitism. We didn't know it was going to turn murderous. The Nazis didn't know that it was going to turn murderous yet in 1933. But Americans have other things on their minds. And in the 1930s, the Gallup polling organization that we know gets founded. Gallup starts in 1935, starts polling Americans. So here's a question they asked them. This is 1936, so we're 7 years into a depression, right? A 7-year depression is a long depression. We're 7 years into a depression. Do you think there will be another serious depression? The economy is getting a little better in 1936, and you can see that 2/3 of Americans are still pretty pessimistic about the economy, thinking that there will be another serious depression. I mentioned this one. This is 1937. Do you think it was a mistake for the United States to enter World War I? 70% of Americans say yes. Gallup asks this constantly, especially because Americans they see what's happening in Europe, right? They see that the Nazis are leading Europe to war, and that the United States wants to stay out of this war. So 70% in 1937 want to stay out of the war, and in 1938, I find this a really fascinating question. Gallup asks, do you think the persecution of Jews in Europe has been their own fault? So just the fact that Gallup would ask the question shows what Americans knew, right? Americans knew that there was serious persecution of Jews in Europe. Otherwise, why would you ask the question, right? And if you add up partly and entirely, you get about 2/3, right? 65% of Americans who are asked are blaming Jews in Europe for the persecution of Jews in Europe. This is one of the ways that anti-Semitism functions, is a notion that if someone's persecuting Jews, it must be because of something they did. And that's common throughout American history. So we can't look at this history and think, oh, there was anti-Semitism in Germany and there was no anti-Semitism here in the United States. In fact, there was anti-Semitism here in the United States. There were organizations throughout the United States that sympathized with Nazism. They were small, but they were there. But then there's just a more generalized anti-Semitism that characterizes American society in 1938. So that's kind of the first 5 years. In the first 5 years, after Hitler comes to power in January of 1933, Nazism is confined to Germany. There's a few exceptions. There's a few territories on the edges of Germany that the Nazis try to take and say these always belong to Germany. But things change in really significant ways in 1938 for a couple of reasons. The first is that in the spring of 1938, the Nazis annex Austria. Right? They go into Austria overnight, they destroy Austria, and it becomes part of Germany. It's an event known as the Anschluss, or the annexation. There are 250,000 Jews who live in Austria. So one day they're not living under Nazism, and the next day they are living under Nazism. Right? Sometimes when we talk about Germany in 1933 and 1938, we use that metaphor of the frog in boiling water, right? Like it happens slowly. In these countries that are east, like Austria, and as we'll see in 1939, Poland, it happens overnight. The Nazis hold this sham vote. They go into Austria in the spring of 1938, and then they have a vote after they've gone in, a vote. And 99% of Austrians say, yes, we wanted Nazi Germany to take over Austria. So it becomes part of Greater Germany. And so for Americans, again, that's not a secret story, that's headline news. And for Americans, they realize, oh, Hitler has greater territorial ambitions than we thought, right? The United States and Roosevelt's administration hoped that the problem of Nazism would stay confined to Germany, and that eventually it would go away, and that we wouldn't have to get involved. But as they see the Nazis start to take more territories, and especially Austria, Americans start to realize this is a bigger problem than we realized. And then, so that's in the spring of 38. And then in November of 38, the Nazis orchestrate a 2-day terrorist attack against Jews living in the boundaries of Germany and the former Austria. It's an event that we know as Kristallnacht, right, or the Night of Broken Glass, November 9th and 10th of 1938. And in this 2-day period, thousands of Jewish shops are destroyed. Hundreds of Jewish synagogues are burned down. German firefighters who are at the fire and are instructed you only put out the fire if it spreads to the next building, right? You let the synagogue burn. And 30,000 Jewish men are arrested overnight and sent to concentration camps. About 100 Jews are killed on Kristallnacht, and then in the weeks after Kristallnacht, there's actually a lot of suicide in the Jewish community after this treatment. So it's banner headlines. I pulled up the Dallas Morning News from November of 1938. Hysterical Nazis wrecked thousands of Jewish shops, burned synagogues in wild orgy of looting and terror. Policemen refused to halt organized riots. So the Nazis wanted this to seem spontaneous. They wanted it to seem like ordinary Germans are rising up and destroying Jewish shops and Jewish synagogues. But it was actually very centrally coordinated, and we know that because we know how the police and the firefighters responded. And nationwide, they responded the same way, by standing by and letting Jews be injured and Jewish shops be destroyed. I did some looking in local papers. I gotta put on my glasses to see this, sorry. This is the Knoxville News Sentinel from November 13th, 1938. You can see on the left, Nazi decree strict Jewry of every means to earn a living, impose a heavy fine. In the days after Kristallnacht, there was all this damage. All these shops destroyed, all these synagogues destroyed. Germany fined Jews for that damage and made the Jewish community pay for that damage. So that's what it's saying would impose heavy fine. Here's the Knoxville Journal front page. On the left side, Nazis broaden drive to erase traces of Jews. Any paper across the country is covering these stories, in large part because they're getting them from the wire services like Associated Press and others. Lisa, Christian, and I were talking about this last night, that the Spear County papers are not, I couldn't find county papers on newspapers.com, but Knoxville, I think Knoxville papers were covering, had some coverage in this area as well. So no matter where you work throughout the United States, you can pull up your local papers in November of 1938, and you're going to see headlines about these attacks on Jews. Gallup goes out on the street again and starts to ask people about it. So first they ask Americans, it was November 1938, 2 weeks after that massive attack, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And you can see 94% of Americans disapprove. This is an overwhelming disapproval of Nazism, right? And again, just the fact that they would ask the question shows what Americans knew and what we had access, what information we had access to. So then they ask a follow-up question. And this is the follow-up question. Should we allow more Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% say no. So I think one of the things, when I'm teaching students, one of the things I want them to struggle with in this history, not to tell them what to think about it, but just to tell them, think about it, is the struggle between disapproval and a will to action on behalf of the victims. And this is hard. It's not easy to act on behalf of the victims. What can I do as an individual? You'll see stories of individuals in the exhibition upstairs who decide to do extraordinary things. Sometimes it's taking in a foster child, right? A refugee who's a foster child. Sometimes it's U.S. government workers breaking laws to aid Jews, right? There's a whole spectrum. But we don't want students to view this history and think, oh, no one could have done anything. But we want them to realize that it's difficult. It's difficult to stand up. It's difficult to act. I think a lot of people look at histories like this and think, what would I do? Which is a normal question to ask. And we want to give them stories of Americans who went against the grain and did extraordinary things. So you'll be able to see stories of that upstairs. Sometimes it's just someone trying to raise information. So this is a kind of forgotten hero of this story. Her name is Dorothy Thompson. She was one of the most influential journalists in the United States in the 1930s. Had one of the biggest microphones. She had a radio show on NBC, as you can see, and she had a syndicated newspaper column that was in about 125 newspapers across the country. So people are reading Dorothy Thompson across the country. She thinks America should be doing more for refugees in the 1930s, especially for Jews who are trying to get out of Germany. And she writes this book in 1938 that's just called Refugees. It's a little book. She's just trying to raise awareness. She writes it really quickly. One of the things she writes in this book is, it is a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times, that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. So what's she talking about? She's talking about all the bureaucratic forms you needed to immigrate to the United States. In 1924, the United States had passed a very restrictive immigration law that was designed to make it bureaucratically difficult to get into the United States. I'm not going to read these all out to you. There's not going to be a quiz later, right? But this is overwhelming. And it's meant to be overwhelming. These are all the forms that you needed to get into the United States at the time. Some of these forms are expensive, right? So you need money to immigrate. Some of these forms have short expiration dates, right? You might get a form and it's valid for 3 months. And you got to line up your other forms while that form is valid, or you got to start over. I'll point out just a few things on here, and then we can go a little deeper into this. Even the second one down, 2 copies of an applicant's birth certificate. Not everyone who was born in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century bothered to get a birth certificate. My wife's grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, didn't have a birth certificate. She was born in 1910 in Germany. She had to figure out when she was in her 20s, how do I go get a birth certificate? Something like this, a certificate of good conduct from German police authorities. That meant if you're a Jewish person who wants to leave Germany in the 1930s, you had to go to a Gestapo office, which is the German secret police, and ask for that certificate of good conduct. That could be a terrifying experience, right? That could stop you. You might say, I'm not doing that, right? I'm going to wait it out and see how things are here. The key thing on our side is number 4, 2 sponsors. If you wanted to immigrate to the United States, this isn't true just for Jews, this is true for anyone. If you wanted to immigrate to the United States under this restrictive immigration law, and by the way, this restrictive immigration law was passed in 1924, and it's on the books until 1965. It's President Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, who changes immigration law. So it's 40 years of very restrictive immigration from 1924 to 1965. You needed sponsors. Those sponsors had to sign a legal form, an affidavit, that said, I'm going to take care of this immigrant financially. right? We are in the depths of a terrible depression in the 1930s. We don't want people who can come here who can't take care of themselves financially. The language of the day in the 1930s in immigration law, they called it likely to become a public charge. They didn't want someone who was likely to become a public charge. So you want to sponsor an immigrant. You have to sign an affidavit that says you're going to take care of them financially, and you have to literally deposit money in a bank to prove it. I've looked at thousands of potential immigration cases from the 1930s, files of thousands of potential immigrants. The money varies, but roughly it's often between $2,000 and $2,500. $1938. Average laborer, 1938, made about $2,000 a year. Right, so it's about an average annual salary. If you put it into one of those inflation calculators, you get to about $55,000 or $60,000 today per person. So you needed access to a sponsor. The State Department, you can see at the end, relatives preferred. If the sponsor wasn't your relative, the State Department was more skeptical. Why would this stranger be helping someone? Right? If it was your cousin, yeah, okay, I understand why your cousin might be helping you, but why would a stranger be helping? So you needed access to someone in the U.S. who had some means, who could sponsor you. Sometimes there were organizations that tried to sponsor people, tried to sponsor children, and tried to raise money. There were many denominations, Quakers, Mennonites, Unitarians, who do a lot of work to try to fundraise to sponsor refugees, and Jewish organizations, of course, as well. On the German side, to leave, you had to list all your assets before you left, so the Nazis could rob you of all those assets. Right? The Nazis wanted Jews to leave early on so that they could take their assets and rob them. You were allowed as an immigrant to take pocket change out of Germany. So it varies by time and place. Sometimes it's 10 Reichsmarks, sometimes it's 20 Reichsmarks. It'd be like coming to the United States with $40 at the time. So on one side, to leave, you have to let the Nazis rob you of everything you have. And on this side, you have to prove that you can take care of yourself financially. Right? So you're getting squeezed from both ends. A lot of students ask me all the time, why didn't the Jews just leave? Right? And this shows you how hard it was to leave. I mean, I understand the question and the spirit of the question, but it's actually not the right question. The question is, why did the United States and other nations make it so hard for immigrants to get in? And again, all those preconditions I showed you at the beginning are that host of reasons. So one way I think about this is Albert Einstein was a refugee. He came to the United States in 1933 from Germany, a Jewish refugee from Germany. He was sponsored by a university that brought him over to teach. So he had kind of a smooth path. He was already famous. He was one of the most famous people in the world by that point. And he becomes an advocate for refugees, like Dorothy Thompson was. And he writes a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, to the First Lady, it's either 1940 or 41, where he's trying to convince, she's basically saying, can't your husband do something about this, right? Can't we get the president to open the doors a little bit more? It's really up to Congress. It's not up to the president. Congress has to pass laws for immigration. But he says, one of the things Einstein writes in that letter to Eleanor Roosevelt is, the U.S. government has erected a wall of bureaucratic measures to keep immigrants out. The U.S. government is, so Holocaust historians talk about paper walls, right? Sometimes walls are literal, and sometimes the walls are paper. And these paper walls really do keep immigrants out. You start to see graphics like this in American newspapers. This one happens to be from the Oakland, California Tribune in November of 1938. It's asking on the top, how many refugees can we take? And I know the slide's a little blurry, but it's a map of Europe. There's a lot, the countries in black are basically either Nazi taken over or Nazi allied, right? Like Italy, for example. And there's two numbers under each country. So on the left-hand side, the left number for each country is an estimate of the number of Jews who live in that country at that moment. The estimates are pretty good. Poland says 3.25 million. Yeah, this is really blurry. Hungary says 444,000. Romania says 984,000. 175,000 Jews in Lithuania, for example. And then on the right of the dash, you have another number. And those numbers are much smaller. That number is basically the U.S. quota, which means that number is the number of immigrants, the number of visas that the U.S. government can issue in a year to people who are born in that country. The number of visas that the State Department can issue to people born in that country in any given year, right? So there are 984,000 Jews in Romania, and we can issue a maximum of 377 visas a year to people born in Romania. Even Poland, and Poland is where most of the murder takes place of Jews during the Holocaust. Poland has 3.2 million Jews. 3 million of them are going to die in the Holocaust within the 7 years after this. And the quota, we can issue 6,524 visas a year to people born in Poland, not just Jews, anybody who wants to come to the United States. So there's no way and some people say, well, why didn't the United States just issue all the immigration visas it could, and it would have saved everyone during the Holocaust? There's no way that's true. We were issuing very, very small number of visas, and in fact, in most years between 1933 and 1945, we underissued the visas. This is the maximum limit. But consular officers are not sitting around at the State Department saying, let's issue all the visas we can. They're underissuing the visas. So there are hundreds of thousands of visas that go unissued during this period. So if you look at what happens to immigration in U.S. history during this period, along the bottom, we've just got years from 1900 to 1932. So again, this is before Nazism, and it's just a raw number of immigrants going up to the top line is 1.2 million a year. So you see, 1907, 1908 is a peak of U.S. immigration. It's almost 1.3 million immigrants coming in. The population of the United States at that time is like 115, 120 million. And over 1 million immigrants coming in. And that is a huge number. And so today, I think, what are we? 330 million. But at that time, it's 115 million. This is World War I, right? It's pretty hard to cross the Atlantic when Europe is at war. So you see a precipitous drop, a little bit of a rise, but then we passed that restrictive immigration law in 1924, and you see we're under 200,000 immigrants. So immigration is already cut before the Nazis rise to power by 85, 90%. This is a period in U.S. history where we don't want immigrants coming in, even before things get bad for the Jews in Europe. And then this is the Depression, right? I mean, there's nothing happening in terms of immigration once we start the Depression, really, in 1930. So what happens is Jews and others get caught on waiting lists. I just picked 4 countries, and this is just a snapshot in time. January of 1939, when things are getting really bad for Jews in Europe, about 6 weeks after Kristallnacht. Germany's quota, we can issue 27,370 visas in a year, and there's 240,000 applicants, right? So that's a 9-year waiting list. Poland has a 12-year waiting list. Romania has a 43-year waiting list. Immigration is not going to solve the problem for Jews in Europe anymore. And then war is coming. And for a civilian to cross the Atlantic during war is almost impossible, right? So you've got that period from 1933 until the United States enters the war in 1941, where people say, what could we have done? Well, we could have issued a lot more visas. The United States could have issued a lot more visas than it did, but even that doesn't stop the Holocaust. In 1933, then conditions change again in Europe, right? September 1st, 1939, sorry, I said 1933, 1939. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. France and England declare war, and Europe is at war again. Here are Americans reading headlines from the newspaper on September 2nd. War, bombs raining on Warsaw. War begins in Europe, and Americans want to stay out of it. So the president, Roosevelt, takes to the airwaves in a fireside chat 2 days after the war begins, and he says, this nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well, right? We're anti-Nazi. We just don't want to go to Europe to fight them. And Roosevelt, so September, think about this period of history, September 1939, when Europe goes to war. And the United States enters December 7th, 1941, right, when Japan attacks at Pearl Harbor. So you've got like 26 months, you've got a 2-year period there, where FDR is going to spend most of his political capital trying to move a very reluctant nation to start to assimilate the idea that we're going to have to enter this war to defeat Nazism. FDR as a president, he'd been president by this point already, he's late into his second term, and he's thinking about running for a third term. When he does run for a third term, the anti-FDR forces in America says, we don't want a dictator here, they have a dictator over there, right? So there's a lot of anti-FDR sentiment when he decides to break tradition and run for a third term. But one of the things we know about FDR as a president by this point is he's very savvy as a politician, and he doesn't want to fight battles he's not going to win. So he thinks he can win on moving the United States towards intervention. He doesn't think he can win on changing the Americans' minds on immigration, especially Congress. There's no will in Congress to open the doors to more immigrants at this moment of crisis. And so FDR doesn't fight for that. He spends all of his political capital fighting to move us towards intervention in this war. And he's doing it against a strong tide. There's a protester at the White House hanging signs on the fence. This is when you used to actually be able to get much closer to the White House than you can get today. The fence right outside the White House, FDR, you're preparing for war, you fighting. We see isolationist organizations rise up, like the America First Committee, which is, again, based in my hometown of Chicago. This is one of their propaganda posters from 1940-41. It says, war's first casualty. There's a missile going through Lady Liberty's arm, right? So if we go to war, what are we going to lose in America? We're going to lose our liberty. And that's why we should stay out of war. There's a lot of people arguing for that. America First is arguing we have to defend our borders, but we don't have to go fight over there. And that's the sentiment of a lot of Americans at the time. America First would hold these rallies. This is an America First rally from 1941. You can see on like the bunting of the stage, it says Defend America First. They always have pictures of George Washington, because in George Washington's farewell address, George Washington didn't have to leave office after 2 terms, but he chose to, and that became a tradition in the United States until FDR. And one of the things that Washington said in that farewell address was the United States shouldn't have entangling alliances with other countries. The America First movement reads that as we should be isolated. It's a little more complicated than that, but Washington's a hero of theirs. And the man at the podium is Charles Lindbergh, one of the most famous Americans at the time. Lindbergh had flown solo across the Atlantic in 1927, the first person to ever do that. I think it took him over 24 hours to make that flight across the Atlantic. He flew really close to the water so it would splash him in the face and keep him awake for some of the flight. And it's kind of an amazing story. By 1941, 14 years later, he's the celebrity spokesperson for America First. And he gives this speech in Des Moines, Iowa, in September of 1941, where he says, look, it seems like we're leading ourselves to war. And there's 3 groups. He says it's not too late to stay out, but there's 3 groups that are moving us towards this war, and these are the groups that have to be stopped. So who are these groups? First, he says, okay, the British want us to go to war. This makes sense. It's 1941. France has fallen to the Nazis. Other Western European nations have fallen to the Nazis. He says, of course, Britain wants us to have their back, right? They're the last line of defense in Europe against Nazism. That makes sense to him. He says, the second group that wants us to go to war is FDR and his administration, because he's been lying to you for 2 years. Lindbergh hates Roosevelt. Roosevelt hates Lindbergh. And he says the president's a liar. The president knows the only way out of this bad economy is to get us into the war. He's wanted us in the war all along. You can't believe a word he says, right? And then he says, and the third group that's leading us to war are the Jews in America. And he doesn't deny that Jews are being persecuted. He says the persecution of Jews in Germany and across Europe is terrible. So of course they want us to go to war. But then he does this kind of flip in the speech, and he says, but look, if we go to war, there's going to be a backlash against Jews in the United States. He basically threatens Jews in the United States to say, if we go to war, we'll see a rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States. And then he slips into all these very common anti-Semitic lies. He says, we're getting more and more messages from the press that we should go to war. And isn't that because Jews control the press? And we're getting more movies out of Hollywood that say we should fight the Nazis. And isn't that because Jews control Hollywood? So all these notions, all these conspiratorial notions about secret Jewish control that are so essential to anti-Semitism, Lindbergh starts to repeat them in this speech. The speech is actually not received well. People think, some people start to ask, is Lindbergh himself a Nazi or a Nazi supporter? We get political cartoons like this. This is from Theodore Geisel, who was a very young political cartoonist in 1941. This is way before Green Eggs and Ham and his children's books as Dr. Seuss, but you can recognize the style, right? And it's a mother wearing an America First sweater. She's reading a terrifying story to her children called Adolf the Wolf. And what the book says is, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, so it didn't really matter. This fight, we have a 2-year fight of, are we going to war or aren't we going to war? And it's really only settled by the attack at Pearl Harbor. This is Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Japan attacks the United States. We declare war. The United States declares war on Japan the next day. We don't declare war on Germany. But Hitler declares war on the U.S. 3 days later, on December 11th of 1941, which many people think was one of his biggest mistakes, to declare war on the United States. But there was a pact that they had with Japan that if one was at war with a nation, the other would declare war on the nation. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the United States at war and what that looked like. And then I want to talk about 1945 for a couple minutes, and then we'll have a break before we can go upstairs and see a lot of this in the exhibition. Our first response to war at home is to round up our own citizens off the west coast of Seattle, Washington State, Oregon, California, people of Japanese ancestry and Japanese American citizens, and remove them to inland camps. 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly, or 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them were Americans. American citizens were removed to places like this, Manzanar, in Independence, California, and held in camps throughout the war because of fear that they would be spying for the Japanese enemy. So we're living in a climate in the United States, once we're at war, of huge fear of foreigners, right? Or people who are perceived as foreign, and huge fear of spies. This will also make it almost impossible for Jewish immigrants to make it to the United States at that point. You start to see press coverage like this. This is the NAACP's magazine, Americans in Concentration Camps, that's covering this. So again, this wasn't secret, but we have a climate of, we're living in a climate of fear of foreigners once we're at war. We also learned, so in 1941, mass murder begins of Jews in Europe, right? For the first couple of years of the war, the Nazis and the Soviets are allied. But then in June of 1941, in the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union and breaks their pact. And as they start to enter the Soviet Union, they start to murder Jews there in the towns that they find. They round up Jews in small towns, known as shtetls, take them out off into a forest outside of a small town where the victims will dig their own mass grave and they'll be shot in pits. That's how the Holocaust starts. The Nazis don't start gassing of Jews until the spring of 1942. But in that first 9 months, the Nazis murder about 1.5 million Jews in what historians call the Holocaust by bullets. They're just moving into towns where Jews live and shooting them where they live. Americans find out about this as it's happening. This is a telegram you can see on the top right. It's dated August 29th of 1942. So this is just about a year after mass murder begins. This is a telegram that was sent to a representative of an organization called the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland. Information was leaking out of occupied Poland about what was happening. And it says here, received alarming report that in Führer's headquarters, so in Hitler's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration. All Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, numbering 3.5 to 4 million, should, after deportation and concentration in the East, at one blow exterminated to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe. The Nazis' euphemism was the Jewish question, or the Jewish problem. So this doesn't have all the details of the Holocaust, but this information makes it to the State Department that what the Nazis are doing is concentrating Jews in ghettos, putting them on trains, and sending them to killing centers in occupied Poland where they're being gassed. The State Department receives this information in August of 1942, and the first thing they do is they dismiss it as what they call an unreliable war rumor. There's a lot of rumors that circulate during the war, and this must be another war rumor. Ultimately, this information makes it to individuals in the Jewish community in the United States, and they go to the State Department and they say, is this true? Is this really happening? And the State Department says, we don't know. Give us some time to figure it out. The State Department takes 3 months, and in November of 1942, they confirm that this is happening through secret intelligence sources in Poland. And they say to Jewish leaders in the United States, this is true, this is happening, we're not going to say anything about it. But we're not going to stop you from saying anything about it. So Jewish leaders go to the press in November of 1942, and you start to see headlines like this. This is the Los Angeles Times, November 1942. Nazis wiping out Jews in cold blood. Half of Jews in Europe dead. The statistics here are not exactly right, but the story's right. That Jews are being sent to death camps in the East to be killed there during the Holocaust. Here is the Knoxville Journal. 2 million Jews slain by Nazis. Dr. Wise says, Rabbi Stephen Wise is the leader who went to the press with this. So this is it's a wire service story. You might be able to see the AP at the top right next to November 24th, but this is on the front page of a Knoxville newspaper. Here's another one, the Knoxville News Sentinel. Kill all Jews plan discussed. Right? So I started by saying if people were paying attention, they had access to this information as it was happening. This is only 1942. The war and the Holocaust are going to go on until 1945. And the American press coverage is there. But that's not what the war looks like for Americans. This is what the war looks like. These are propaganda posters issued by the U.S. government in 1943. These would have been in libraries. They would have been in civic centers. They would have been in post offices. They would have been in schools. Anywhere you went, you would have seen these posters produced by the American government. This is the enemy, a dagger going through a Bible, right? So the Nazis are the enemies of American Christianity, or we're fighting to prevent this, a hand wearing a swastika ring, and our founding documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, are on fire, right? That's why we're fighting. Or we're fighting for American children. These are efforts to raise war bonds, right? To raise money to support the U.S. war effort. Don't let that shadow touch them. There's a looming swastika shadow in the grass here that you can see. So we go to war not to rescue Jews. We go to war to fight for democracy against fascism. We go to war to defeat the Nazis, but not to rescue Jews. And that might sound weird to pull apart, but at the time, for Americans, this is not a war about rescuing Jews. In FDR's White House, when asked, they would say, the way you stop the killing is you stop the killers. When there were proposals to rescue Jews, FDR and his administration actually would say that's a diversion from the war effort. The killing stops when you stop the killers. This leaves a lot of people very uncomfortable today to pull these things apart so much. But one of the ways I think about it, and one of the ways that the exhibition tries to push people to think about it, is the Nazis fight 2 wars. The Nazis fight a war against the Allies, and the Nazis fight a war to kill all the Jews of Europe. And those two wars are equally important to the Nazis. In response, the Allies fight one war. They fight a war to defeat fascism. They do not fight a war to rescue the Jews of Europe. And we should not minimize that 16 million Americans serve in this war. And over 400,000 Americans die in this war. And Americans on the home front are mobilized on this war to make sacrifices to defeat Nazism. It defines their generation, the defeat of Nazism. It's a monumental undertaking and an important milestone in U.S. history. But their purpose is not to rescue Jews. So where does that leave us, and how do we know that? In 1945, American troops start to encounter Nazi concentration camps. This is April 12th of 1945. This is Eisenhower, right here, General Eisenhower, with his hands on his hips, who will become president in the 1950s. He's the head of the Supreme Allied Command. He's at Ohrdruf here, which is a sub-camp of Buchenwald in Germany. And he cannot believe what he's seeing when he walks into this camp. He had access to more information than anyone, right? Or as much access to as much information as anyone. He writes back to General Marshall in the United States in April of 1945, and he writes, everything that we've read to date has been an understatement. So I've been standing here for close to an hour talking to you about how much information Americans had. All that information was words. It was all printed stories in newspapers or radio. We didn't have visuals like this because we didn't have reporters on the ground where it was happening until the war was over. And I think that matters. I think for Americans at that time, seeing is believing. And they want to doubt. When you hear stories that are this atrocious, that are this horrible, you want to doubt that they're true. And Americans have a lot of doubt. Even Eisenhower has doubt. The fact that Eisenhower can write back to Washington, D.C. and say everything we've read to date has been an understatement. He also insists that newspaper editors, American newspaper editors, come to see this, come to Germany to see the camps, and that Congress people, elected officials, come. And that happens very quickly in April of 1945, because Eisenhower is already worried that people are going to deny these crimes. We think about Holocaust denial as a problem today. Eisenhower was smart enough to be thinking about it in April of 1945. He said this all has to be documented, and it is documented in newsreels. So this is April of 1945. This is May 8th of 1945, VE Day in Times Square. Right? Americans have made these incredible sacrifices to defeat Nazism. Right? But look at what the war is about. It's VE Day. Last German units yield. Remember Pearl Harbor. Right? Remember we were attacked. Avenge that attack. So as these images start to leak out that we so readily associate with the Holocaust, we're also at a moment of American celebration, or even celebration in a way of defeating Hitler. Right here's Time magazine, May 7th of 1945, Hitler with a bloody red X over his face. It coexists with images like this. Life magazine, the most popular American magazine, May 7th, 1945. Here's a boy walking along the side of the road of the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, and the road is littered with bodies. And these are images from Buchenwald. If you flip the pages further, there's really ghastly images of American soldiers encountering other concentration camps. Americans see this in their newspapers. They see it in newsreels, right? Americans used to go to the movies, and before the movies, you'd have 10 minutes of newsreels that showed you the news of the world. So here, Army Signal Corps films showing Nazi atrocities in April and May of 1945. And there Americans really first start to see these atrocities that they didn't see as they were happening. So the United States is fundamentally transformed by this history of encounter with Nazi Germany. You think about the United States' role in the world before World War II and after World War II. Any time after World War II that we see atrocities abroad, the world often looks to the United States first, right, and says, what is the United States going to do? That wasn't as true in the era before World War II. We mobilized as a society. This leads to huge changes in human rights law, in how we think about punishing the perpetrators of atrocities, right? Like in World War II, you have total victory and full punishment of the criminals, unlike World War I, where we had a negotiated peace. I mean, things really do change. But on the immigration question for Americans, things don't change that much. And we see that even in December of 1945, Gallup goes out and asks again, should we permit more persons from Europe to come to this country each year than we did before the war? Should we keep the number about the same, or should we reduce the number? And you can see that only 5% of Americans, even after we've learned about what's happened to Jews in Europe, want more immigrants to come in, and 37% want more restriction on immigration, even 6 months after the war. So there is this kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, that we have to struggle with. On the one hand, America's role in the world is fundamentally transformed. On the other hand, we don't see the needle move that much on immigration, even as a result of the Holocaust. And as I said, it won't be until 1965, under President Johnson, that immigration law changes. So these are, now that you've seen this, some of the images upstairs will be familiar to you. I didn't tell you everything that's in the exhibition upstairs, but you'll see some of these same images and some of these same stories, as well as stories of Americans, as I said, who really took extraordinary measures to try to help people who were being persecuted abroad. There's also there's a number of kiosks that are basically just small iPads on stands where you can do things like look at news coverage around the United States. You can pick state by state. There's 3 articles up there from Tennessee. There's 3 articles from each state across the country, because we're running across the country with this. So you can see how Americans were reading their news of Nazism. There's more newsreel footage on one of the iPads of FDR and Lindbergh arguing back and forth in their public speeches to each other. There's an interactive that shows the movement of U.S. troops kind of across a calendar. So where were the troops at various times between 1942 and 1945 in Europe, and where was the killing of Jews happening? Right, the killing of Jews was happening way beyond the reach of American troops. Think about D-Day, right? June 6, 1944. We're landing in Normandy, Western Europe. All the killing is still happening in occupied Poland, which is incredibly far from Normandy. So some people say, why did the U.S. troops just march into the camps? The U.S. troops are nowhere near those camps until 1945, and in fact, the killing centers in occupied Poland are liberated by the Soviets. The American troops are liberating camps in the West, not camps in the East. So those interactives will give you more, those iPad screens will give you more to watch up there as well. I will hang out upstairs and be happy to answer questions as well as you walk through the exhibition. I think what we're going to do is I'll give people kind of a quick lay of the land, and then you can go through the exhibition kind of at your own pace, but I'll be around to answer questions. So I really appreciate you being here. Again, I'm so pleased that the exhibit could come to Sevier County, and I hope that this has been a useful session for you, and that you have the chance to spread the word to other people. Thanks very much.